Hi guys, welcome to Nature of the International System, spring of 2026. In this week's lecture, we talked about the goals for the class and reviewed the syllabus, and then we got right into the material asking questions like, what is international relations? What is theory, its purpose, and how to distinguish good theories from maybe less than good theories? We also talked about some of the main theoretical traditions, realism, neoliberalism, and constructivism as lenses by which we could understand the world. And finally, we talked a bit about levels of analysis, which I'll review next time and finish that material. In this short video, I'm going to recap some of the main points and set us up for next week. The goals for the class are really to provide you with a set of conceptual tools or lenses by which to understand the world, to break down a more complex reality and see it in terms of the most important features. And there's no single right way of doing that. There are a variety of different perspectives that allow us to do that. And the bet that I'm making is that that will help you become better practitioners, that if you're more intentional and have better self-understanding of the implicit assumptions that you have in your head, and maybe interrogate them and change your views because you've been exposed to new material, that if you do that, you'll be a more effective change agent in the world when you go out into work professionally. And I want you to be able to connect these conceptual tools to current events in ways that allow you to move beyond just merely reading the news for understanding of what's happening, but why things are happening. I want to familiarize you with how key issue areas are governed. And finally, I want to provide you with diverse perspectives and points of view that may challenge your own preconceptions, expose you to different ways of thinking, either in terms of scholarly traditions or people from other countries, so that you are ultimately in a better position to defend the views that you have, and that you may change and grow over the course of the semester and alter your views in keeping with new evidence and new arguments. So those are the goals for the class. We started off by talking about what is international relations, and it's important to do that because that's the discipline that I'm trained in and that the material draws upon. So international relations is a subfield of political science, and it's the study of the interactions of the various actors that work on problems that transcend borders. And international, on some level in the old days, might have connoted just efforts to study interstate relations of problems that transcended borders and how states sought to address those issues. But in the world in which we live, we recognize that states, as in governments of countries, are not the only actors. There are other important actors: intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, there are foundations, multinational corporations, there are nasty non-state actors like drug traffickers, among others. All of those are part of this wider milieu of dealing with problems that transcend borders. And that's what we're going to be studying this semester. And on some level, in a policy-oriented way, we're going to be assessing how is it that these various actors seek to manage or resolve problems that transcend borders. That includes states, but is not limited to them. We talked about what is theory, its purpose, and what are the principles for identifying good theories. Now, theories are simplifications of a more complex reality. They're a set of conceptual tools to help us make sense of the world, either by describing it or by explaining what has happened and why. And in so doing, many theories often are structured in a way where there's something you're trying to explain, and in statistical terms, we think of that as the dependent variable. And then there are a set of factors that we think may explain that outcome, right? Like they're the drivers that lead to that outcome. In statistical terms, those would be called the independent variables. The theory would be the sets of assumptions about how those independent variables, those drivers, are connected to that outcome that you're trying to explain, the dependent variable. So if you're trying to say that authoritarian countries tend to have more human rights abuses, the thing you're trying to explain is human rights abuses. And the thing that's driving that explanation is the nature of the regime type, right? In this case, authoritarian regimes. Now, we might want to assess whether or not those associations are true, and we also want to think about why those things are related. So the theory part would help us understand why those things are related and why we would expect to see that, right? And in this case, we might say that authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, tend to have fewer checks and balances on their leaders, and so their leaders are freer to violate the rights of their citizens. Whereas in democratic countries, there are more checks and balances, court systems that presumably citizens can appeal to protect them so that their rights are not violated. So that would be the theory that would help us understand how those things are connected. And we can make a whole set of theories for a variety of things we're trying to explain. Why there's war, or why there's peace, or why countries trade with each other, or many other kinds of questions that we want to try to answer. And we have different theoretical tools and schools of thought to try to explain what we tend to see in the world, try to make sense of patterns, both describe what the patterns are and why they're happening. And that's really the purpose of theory. And I gave you an example. Now, how do we think about what makes for good theory? And there are different principles, and we talked about at least 3 of them in class. The first has to do with generalizability. Does a theory explain a range of outcomes across time and space? And we might think that a theory that it can explain outcomes across different geographies and across different times, across history, that might be a better theory. But that's only one principle, and we don't have to privilege that as the only principle. Another principle might be falsifiability, and this is associated with a particular research tradition called positivism, but we might want to ask, is there evidence to support the theoretical claims, like the hypotheses connecting cause and effect? What our expectations are, like we expect to see authoritarian regimes experiencing more human rights violations. Do we see that in practice? Can we observe that? And is this theoretical expectation or hypothesis supported? If it isn't, then we might say that's a bad theory. If it can't be validated one way or the other, if the predictions aren't falsifiable, then it's very hard to assess whether or not it's supported. So falsifiability is another important criteria that makes for good theory, at least according to those in the positivist tradition. And there are other scholarly traditions like postmodernism and critical theory that sort of dispute the idea. But nonetheless, generalizability, falsifiability are 2 important principles. The third is parsimony. And this is the idea that perhaps the simplest explanation is the best one. If you can explain a lot with a very little, like one single factor seems to drive outcomes across a range of cases, then maybe that's better than a more complex explanation that has a lot of moving pieces. Like the causes of war can be reducible to one main factor that seems to explain a lot of different wars. That would be a parsimonious explanation that is very spare, that may not be able to explain every specific case, but may get at the central tendencies across time and space. So again, we don't have to privilege parsimonious explanations. Sometimes we want more complex, multi-causal explanations that are very specific for a particular outcome in question, but we might think that parsimony is another principle that makes for good theory. All of this is to say, we need theories to help us make sense of the world, because the facts of the world do not speak for themselves. We have to impose certain ideas about how the world works and how things are connected to make sense of the world. We all have implicit theories in our head. Better that they're explicit and that we can seek to evaluate them and understand whether or not they're supported or not, and change our ideas if circumstances demand it. And all of this is in the service of becoming a better practitioner, so that we can judge not only what we should expect to see, but also what might work if we're trying to change the world and make it better. And having a better appreciation of theory can help us understand what is possible given how we think about how the world works. There are three main research families or traditions in contemporary international relations, two of which, realism and liberalism, have antecedents that go back hundreds of years. Constructivism is a more recent entry. I think we can learn from all three of them and borrow from them in different ways to construct our own understanding of how we think the world works. We don't necessarily have to be wedded to one particular research tradition and interpret the world solely through that specific lens. Now, the way to think about how to distinguish them comes down to our assumptions about what the scope for cooperation and peace is in the world, and what actors we think are most important, and what factors we think are most important. And so realism and liberalism really differ in their degree of optimism about the scope for cooperation and peace in the world, where realism is quite pessimistic about the scope for cooperation and peace, that violence and the risk of war is ever present in realist theory, whereas liberal theories tend to have more optimism about the scope for cooperation in the world and for countries to work together to resolve problems. Those are two of the primary distinctions between realist theories and liberal theories. Constructivist theories are a little different in that they have perhaps more emancipatory potential, in that constructivist theories emphasize the importance of ideas and non-material factors, the role of identity and the role of changing norms in society that can be championed by social groups or people promulgating new ideas. And those new ideas could make the world a lot better. They could also make the world a lot worse. And so constructivist theories are a little different from the other two, in that it's not necessarily inherently optimistic or pessimistic. It just focuses on different factors than what the other two theories focus on. Now, realist theories tend to be state-centric. They focus on the importance of states and how they respond to pressures in the international system, and how the world is always prone or poised to descend into violence. And some of that can be rooted in human nature. Some of that could be rooted in the structure of the international system or other factors. But that's what ultimately lends and leads realists to be pretty pessimistic about the scope for cooperation. Liberal theories have a number of different variants. Some are pretty state-centric, but recognize that there's a role for international institutions to foster cooperation, to help states work together to realize their national interests, right? Other liberal theories are more pluralistic and focus on the pulling and hauling of interest groups in society to compete for political office and shape the foreign policy of their countries. And so those kinds of liberal theories are more bottom up and have slightly different emphasis on the actors in society that are important. Liberal theories and realist theories tend to be focused more on the importance of material factors that drive state behavior and understandings of self-interest. So countries are worried about protecting their own security or getting wealthy, and the factors that drive their assessments of national interests seem to be about what will make them more secure or what will make them materially better off. Constructivists focus on a wider set of concerns and suggest that the national interest isn't a fixed quantity that is solely guided by calculations of narrow self-interest, but there are wider ideas about appropriate behavior and then the norms in society at the national level or international level that can really shape countries' self-understandings of what's important, like ideas about whether it's proper and appropriate to enslave other people, or ideas about religious identity at the national or cross-border level. And so in this sense, the national interest isn't a fixed quantity, and that other factors, ideas and norms about appropriate behavior, about identity, can shape and socialize states to even reconceive their national interests. So these are the three main research traditions that we're going to learn more about in subsequent weeks, and I'll try to identify to you scholars in different research traditions so that you have a sense of where they're coming from as you read them. And you should be able to recognize which scholars tend to be from a realist persuasion, which ones might come from a liberal tradition, and which ones might come from a constructivist tradition. And hopefully you can decide for yourself which ideas you find most compelling and which theories you gravitate to, or if you want to, like me, borrow ideas from different research traditions to better understand how the world works. As I said, these are sort of conceptual lenses by which we can seek to understand the world, and there may be a time and a place for learning from all of these different theoretical traditions. And in the next section, I'll talk about another way of understanding the world that's a little different from these isms traditions of realism, liberalism, and constructivism, to talk about so-called levels of analysis. The last topic we discussed was levels of analysis. And like the isms before, this is a way of conceptualizing and understanding cases. Each of the three levels privileges different factors in their explanations. So there are three levels, sometimes called images. So first level or first image explanations focus on the role of individuals, typically elite leaders and their perceptions, their personalities, and their choices. The second level are unit level or state level explanations that focus on properties of the state and how the state relates to interest groups in society, right? And then the last level, third level explanations or third image explanations focus on properties of the international system and relations between states in the international system. So let's take a case like, why was there war in Ukraine? First level or first image explanations would focus on the role of key elite leaders like Vladimir Putin. What are his perceptions, personalities, and understandings that drove him to decide to invade Ukraine? Now, you might do this sort of analysis across a range of different leaders for a number of different conflicts and look at what are the personality attributes or cognitive styles of individuals in their decisions to wage war. And these kinds of explanations privilege the agency of key individuals. And this is a style of analysis that's been quite popular among historians. Now, we might also think about there are second level or unit level explanations for the war in Ukraine, which would move beyond simple understanding of the agency and personality of key individuals and look more at the state level attributes of the Russian state that is an authoritarian regime and therefore maybe has fewer checks on its ability to wage war. And indeed, personalist dictatorships like the Russian state might privilege the decisions and input of individuals. So here, the second image properties of the Russian state intersect with first level or first image explanations that enhance the power of single individuals. But that is both a property of the Russian state, but also ways that it intersects with those first image explanations. Now, a different explanation would focus on third level attributes and suggest that the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine has more to do with changes in the balance of power in the wider European context with the European Union and NATO encircling Russia with efforts to expand their trade relationships, or in the case of NATO, potentially to add new members, dating back to the expansion at the end of the Cold War, which Russia saw as a threat, and then more recent efforts to potentially allow Georgia and Ukraine to have a transition to potential membership in NATO. So here, third level or third image explanations would focus on attributes of the international system and suggest that changes in the balance of power were more threatening to Russia. Hence, it decided to invade Ukraine to forestall Ukraine's membership in NATO or in the European Union. Again, we can learn from all three of these images, and maybe they all have something to say, but different levels of analysis will focus on different things and provide us some purchase on outcomes in individual cases or perhaps across a range of cases. And we need to use those levels of analysis to help us understand different perspectives on why things are happening. The last thing I'll say is that next week we're going to talk about several key concepts in international relations, notion of anarchy and its importance in international relations, drawing from the realist tradition, but also a response from liberal theorists. We're also going to talk about the importance of sovereignty as a key foundational institution in the nature of our current international system. And then finally, we're going to talk about the role of race and hierarchy in international relations. So we'll see you next week.